Hello everyone. This video is one more explainer before we jump into market analysis and supply and demand. And it's again critical understanding some of the context with which we use these very simple models. And it's just good to be clear because as you start applying supply and demand, it's natural that you're going to find complexities. It's going to be hard identifying moving one part of the model, supply or demand or prices or what have you, when our reality is that lots of this stuff is moving all the time and these simple models don't seem realistic. But hopefully, as you see when we go through it, supply and demand is a really critical tool for seeing long-term trends, big broad brushstrokes across the economy. Typical applications are, what's going on with the price of oil. That reverberates in a very straightforward manner typically that supply and demand describes. And there's also opportunity for people to misuse or misrepresent supply and demand. So if you know the constraints of the model, the assumptions underlying supply and demand, then you can work through these a little bit better. And so this video wants to lay out the ideas of perfect competition. When we start off with our simplest model of of supply and demand, we're making assumptions about what the market looks like, in that it is working in a competitive environment. So let me go through that very briefly. So there's several assumptions about the market that we're modeling with supply and demand in these examples. So again, it's a perfect competition market. So what does that mean? Again, here's some information on it's this idea of a spherical cow. We use the simple model to understand the world a little bit better. Okay, so 5 assumptions that I want to point out. The first one is we're talking about what we call homogeneous products. And all that's just a fancy word for saying that the good in the market is identical. Okay, so this is microeconomics. We're looking at very specific markets, such as the market for apples. We want to be specific that these are apples, perhaps in the same region. Perhaps this is a very specific type of apple, Macintosh apple. If we're talking about pharmaceuticals, we're not talking about all pharmaceuticals. We're talking about perhaps the market for a specific drug or something like that. If we're talking about corn, we're talking about corn of a similar quality. So as you kind of roughly apply your models here, have that in the back of your mind. You're not applying a very specific type of meat with a very high quality type of meat that would have a totally separate market. So you would model those differently, and you could do both with supply and demand, but we're not aggregating across different types of quality. Okay. A second one that we look at is the buyers and the sellers are similar too. So I like to use the idea of a farmer's market. We go to a farmer's market as customers. You and I, perhaps we have similar budgets for spending at a farmer's market. And then we can go buy apples as we would. You have several apple sellers that are fairly in a comparable situation. What you don't have is you don't have one large buyer, say Bill Gates or somebody, that could buy everything in the farmer's market and leave everybody else with nothing. And on the other hand, you don't have one large seller kind of controlling the market. You don't have a monopoly situation. So as we'll get to that, and we take that into account definitely, but we start off with the basic competitive market principle. So one aspect of this for sellers is if you're thinking about how a Apple seller decides their price, they are constrained in a competitive market. They can't go sell apples for a price that feels good to them, because you have to take information from the market as well. If you try to sell apples at too high of a price when you have other competitors in your local market selling them $1 a pound cheaper, what's going to happen? You're not going to sell. You're going to have no customers if you try to sell too high. If you try to sell too low, maybe to knock your competitors out of the market, that's going to be maybe a good short-term strategy, but is it sustainable if you're not covering your costs? So what we see is competition drives prices down, and any one seller, we call them a price taker. They're a price taker. They cannot set the price by themselves. The market, the interactions of supply and demand in the market is what discovers a price. Similarly to the last 2 points is free entry. Okay, free entry and free exit. Why do prices get driven down if I go to one Apple seller and I see they're selling for $10 a pound, and I look at that, seems maybe a little high to me. I look around and I see $5 a pound across the way. I'm not obliged to stay at the $10 a pound seller. I can freely exit that potential transaction and go to a cheaper, a lower priced seller. So I have free exit in that transaction interaction with that seller. I'm not bound to them. And in the same way, new sellers can freely enter the market. If you have if you have you're growing apples, maybe just been for yourself, and you see an opportunity in the market where you could make a little money, you can get into that market. Of course, you have to maybe rent space or whatever, but there's no real barriers to you entering that market, competing, and maybe making some profit for yourself, maybe making enough to sustain a family business. So you have free entry. Okay, again, this is this is different from what is really essential to monopolies, where there are barriers to entry. And then we talk about that as well, but that's one of the key points that separate a competitive market from a monopolized market. A monopolized market, for some reason, has barriers to entry that does not allow competition to come in, and without competition, it's not driving down prices. Okay, similar to buyers and sellers being similar in their buying power. Another assumption we make is essentially the producers and the sellers in this market are basically the same. You're keeping the level of technology and know-how fairly constant, right? There's not. We're taking a snapshot of the system where all these sellers at this given point of time, they're working on a similar level of technology and know-how. So let's say, all these Apple sellers, they have similar qualities of land, they have access to similar technologies. There's, of course, in reality, there's deviations, but any big jumps in technology, we kind of look at the system as being exogenous. It's going to cause real disruption in the system, in the market. But at a snapshot in time, we're assuming everybody's about the same, and we can model those innovations and things within supply and demand. But we want to be careful that when we're looking at a specific market and a specific point of time, these sellers are practically the same. And then a final key assumption that's sometimes forgot about it's inherent in some of these things, but we want to point it out is that information to buyers to sellers is widely spread. So why is it that everybody has the same technology and know-how? They have the same access to information. You know, they're learning from other people. They're learning from the internet or best practices or from education. They've that level of knowledge is similar at a given point in time. For buyers, information being spread across the market goes back to my example earlier. If I can see that this one has a very high price, $10 a pound, me being able to look across the street, or maybe I hear from someone, hey, there's a good deal over for apples. That's information. So that's information that I'm getting. So we assume in a competitive market that that information is being spread. There's no there's no barriers to entry. There's no barriers to information. And so what this keeps from happening is, you know, some of these poor quality, you know, this is also related to quality, poor quality or harmful effects don't creep into this market because information about, say, somebody selling snake oil or somebody selling bad apples that you don't find out about until you've gotten home, that information through competition is washed out. Okay, so these are key points to keep in mind. Again, this model starts off very, very tight, very, very strict, not realistic, but we want to practice using it and to get some of these fundamental ideas from supply and demand.